Hello, I'm Jake Collins, and this is Knightmare Series 3, Episode 16, which was first broadcast on the 22nd of December 1989. As I've mentioned before, I really like the team in this episode, the 12th and final team of Series 3, Chris, James, Alex and Tim from Bristol. And I think they do an excellent job here, making the final episode of the series entertaining, which isn't always an easy thing to do for the team, the game team, or the production team. There's no chance of a win. There's no sense of, how far are they going to get? It doesn't really matter. It's just a case of trying to make some entertaining scenes to make the final episode of the series worth watching. And Chris, James, Alex and Tim from Bristol certainly make the best of the scenes they're given, I think, to try and fill in this final episode of Series 3. Thanks to them, I do find the episode one of the more entertaining Series 3 episodes, as I've explained before. I do find a lot of troughs when watching Series 3 and get rather bored. Frustrated, certainly, with some of the lack of progress that's being made. But here, lack of progress isn't an issue, because it's the end of the series. Is it entertaining? Do Chris and team keep me interested and engaged with their youth and enthusiasm and cuteness? Yes, they do. They may not be the most on-the-ball team at all times, but I do find them very entertaining to watch. The very end of the bargain between Chris and Hordris here, which as we know sets up so much for the next series with the quest-long pacts, most of which feature Hordris. But you want to watch out there, Chris. Accepting gifts of speed from older men is not something you really should make a habit of. But I guess, in this case, even though Hordris is very much still a shade of dark grey at this point, it's alright in the context of playing Knightmare. This is a very odd scene in an adapted version of Mildred's hovel from the previous series. We haven't seen Mildred since the final episode of Series 2. We haven't seen this room since the penultimate episode of Series 2, but here it is now for this very strange filler scene, just to take up some time as we go towards the end of the series with a pointless but hopefully interesting scene. It's not that interesting, really. Shall we try placing the herbs in the cauldron and the skull ghosts come out? An interesting thing is that one of the skull ghosts is blue. We've seen green ones before, as well as the regular white ones, but this is the only time we see a blue one, so that's moderately interesting, isn't it? I also find the adapted shape of the cauldron moderately interesting. It's more like the shape of the actual Wellway prop, which is also regularly in Series 2 Mildred's cauldron prop, but the sides of the cauldron are more sort of rounded there with Mildred. It looks a lot more like the well here in the Series 3 appearance. So, a couple of things to notice in that scene, but it is the most obvious, horrendous, pointless bit of filler. And I firmly believe that that was actually filmed at the end of level 1, just before they filmed the Wellway room scene with Mrs. Grimwald. Someone's decided, we need a little bit of extra filler. We're not going to have enough level 2 that we're planning to actually use to fill the rest of the episode. We just need a little bit more filler back at the start of level 1. And thus they made that scene with the cauldron and the herbs and the skull ghosts. And why do I particularly think it was filmed there just before the Wellway scene? I think it's making use of two of the same props from that scene. the blue well prop, of course, to be the cauldron, and then the wellway. And that stool there that the herbs were on is also amongst Mrs. Grimwald's furniture in the wellway scene. So I think they've saved themselves some fetching and carrying there, brought in the blue well prop and that three-legged large stool, and done a couple of scenes with them, and then gone back and stuck in that pointless Cauldron Skull Ghost one there between Hordris and Brangwen. Brangwen's in a kind of childish mood today with her couple of nursery rhyme references here. They just about managed to scrape Wee Willie Winkle, more popularly known as Wee Willie Winky, I should think. But they can't get far enough in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe to get to 9-10, and Chris's 7-8 Close the Gate, I think he's just made up on the spot. I've never heard anything for that before except Lay Them Straight, in response, of course, to 5-6 Pick Up Sticks. The significant thing about this scene, of course, is that it's the last wall monster scene. Of course, we have the setup with the clue room and the Synchro Box Guardian carry on into the next series with Oakley. Get adapted in that way, and I've talked before about how that idea is adapted further into Series 5, but then completely abandoned. But here, a wall monster room, a clue table, it's something that goes back to the very first episode, and it's the last time we'll see it precisely in this form. So that's a significant moment, isn't it? And of course, as we get to the end of Series 3, a lot of original aspects of the show and rooms of the show, not that this War Monster room is original, but many of the original rooms are still around. It's all starting to peter out, isn't it? In time for a big change in Series 4. Big cosmetic change. Bigger changes to the gameplay, of course, to come after Series 4. But it always strikes me those significant lasts as we go through Knightmare, seeing these bits that we've seen since the beginning or for a very long time, petering out, and it is always a sobering moment. You know, one thing that really annoys me about Series 3 from the second episode is Treguard saying about Brangwen, all those who live within walls are not always wall monsters. Why on earth did they make him say that? She's the Brangwen she. Are they trying to say she's not quite the same type of creature as Granitas, Igneous, Olgar? Okay, but as far as I'm concerned, as long as Brangwen is in that wall, asking questions for clue objects, she is a wall monster. If she has existed elsewhere in some other form before that, okay, that's absolutely fine. She's a different sort of creature, but now that she lives in that wall, she is a wall monster. She fulfills every parameter to be a wall monster. And I really do wish Treguard had never implied that she wasn't one, because it does cause terminology problems from time to time. I also think, if you're going to discount Brangwen as a war monster, why not also discount Golgarath? He's obviously the same type of creature as her. The animated parts of his face, like Brangwen's face, do seem to have a kind of Greek or Egyptian god look about them. I've always thought. The difference is there, of course, that Treguard specifically implies Brangwen isn't a war monster. No one ever implies Golgarath isn't or says that he is. But really, the way I understand it, and the easiest way to think of it, I think, is that these Clue Room Guardians who live in the walls or inextricably tied to those walls, at least for now, are wall monsters. I wonder where Olga, Granitas, and Igneous have actually gone to live. In Series 3, as their walls have been taken up by other creatures who have thus become the new wall monsters. You can decide that for yourself. Or perhaps, really, it's not worth thinking about because I don't think I ever really have before. But it's a wider idea of nightmare lore you could develop if you wanted. Perhaps they've retired back to the netherworld where they were created. Of course, one thing I'd definitely seen enough of by this point in Series 3 was the Vale of Banburn. But look, they chuck in something unexpected and interesting there. More goblins. Chris is trapped. We wouldn't have been expecting that, would we? After all the other appearances of the Vale of Banburn in this series, Chris's only escape is through that cave behind him. It's always been there, it's never been presented as a possible exit, but here, in this final episode, aha! An interesting, unusual, and unique piece of Knightmare. So that was definitely worth including. I remember Paul McIntosh mentioned that as something interesting that had happened in the Dungeon Valley, the Vale of Banburn. Just chucked in there in the final episode when he wrote about that area for Remember This in the Eye Shield fanzine. And yes, indeed, it is interesting and memorable, and it's the kind of thing that can spice up a final episode of a series of Knightmare, and is all we can really ask from a final episode of a series of Knightmare. Here's Hordress's final appearance in Series 3. There are plenty more appearances to come in subsequent series, of course. And Chris hands him the hourglass to complete their bargain, kind of like the uninitiated are thinking they might be going to do in Series 4. Take the thing that's part of the pact until you meet the character who wants it again, like has happened to Chris here, despite the fact that they've been told to call 3 times when they find the object. A prompt from Treguard is necessary. There's a reward for that object, I believe. Don't you think it's time to redeem your pact with the lady? But that scene with Hordress at the end of the Vale of Banburn there always reminds me of my mum. When I was first watching this on video in the summer of 1999, the first time I'd re-watched it, since it had first been on ITV 9.5 years earlier, Chris comes into the room there, and Hordress is described as the man with the white beard, and my mum comes out with Hordress. Like, how on earth can they not know that? Well, of course, perhaps my mum hadn't really realised this was Series 3. Hordress was extremely new. We'd hardly seen him at all yet. And of course, this team had never seen him before meeting him in their first room after the dice room. So, at the moment, he is the man with the white beard. Whereas, to all of us in years to come, he will become so familiar as Hordress. I used to think of him as Malefact until well into Series 5, actually, because that's what he used to tell people in Series 4 he was called, with all those bargains he kept making. But no, he is definitely, as my mum pointed out, an icon of Knightmare, Hordress. This is another blatant piece of filler, isn't it? This inclusion of the bricked-off window, the panel puzzle. If you've seen Ross calling out the maid, it's blindingly obvious, of course, that you should be going SHIELD because your quest is for the shield. And it's very easy to sit there while watching this on video or even when it was first on and saying, "Oh, come on, it's obvious, it's S.H.I.E.L.D." And I was guilty of doing it myself in the summer of 1999. But then I thought, well, this team hasn't seen the puzzle before. Perhaps they don't really like anagrams. They're obviously not really thinking about the object of their quest. I don't like anagrams. I wouldn't like to be presented with that puzzle either. So I don't judge them too harshly for that, but it does show how they're not the most on the ball of teams. And I do think S.H.I.E.L.D. should have been easier to spot and work out than the Maid. And here we are with that whirlaway room scene as promised. She's got quite a lot of stuff hanging around this time, Mrs. Grimwald, including that large three-legged stool that I mentioned that she's using as a table. They've shuffled that and the well prop around and brought in some more stuff and filmed those two scenes. The Skull Ghost Cauldron scene and then this in a row. I'm quite certain of that. It's only a theory, of course, but it does seem to make a lot of practical sense. Like with Cliff much earlier in the series, we have a bone for Festus here. But this time it leads on to Mrs. Grimwald being attacked off-screen by Festus. You could interpret it as she's being eaten by Festus, but that's not very interesting for future use of the character, and there's so much potential for Mrs. Grimwald and the expanded Grimwald family as we're in Series 6. So I very much prefer to say she's not being eaten by Festus there, just attacked by Festus. Which I guess is a kind of appropriate way to round off the whole Mrs. Grimwald and Festus setup that we've seen and heard throughout Series 3. Festus is so dangerous, he likes to play with people's livers. Well, now he's going to have a go at playing with Mrs. Grimwald's own. Or perhaps he's not going to be that rough with her. And she will survive to be part of the larger Grimwald family in future. When Mrs. Grimwald says to Chris there, "You're going to have to buy it from me," that doesn't sound like a very attractive prospect, does it? She's talking about the food, of course, but what she also gives him there is the third step, and that is the only time the third step is given out on level 1 rather than level 2, which just goes to show we're in a final episode, circumstances are different. What we're doing is showcasing certain rooms, certain scenarios, certain characters, without things necessarily panning out like a normal quest would in a regular, active gameplay episode. All they want to do is have the Mills of Doom for a final appearance, its second appearance in this series, again being used as an alternative to the Spin Dizzy, much less awkward one really. And then we're straight to Merlin's room to get in the 6th appearance of successfully summoning the steps and answering Merlin's questions. I'm sure it hasn't happened nearly as much in this series as Tim Charles and the production team would have liked. But by sneaking it in here very unusually early in level 2 with Chris, we can get Merlin's 8th appearance in the series and the 6th out of 12 possible successful summonings of the 3 steps. And I think Chris does an absolutely excellent job here with his sporting actions. He's a real all-round sportsman. That action he does for the archer, he looks like he's really preparing a longbow and loosing an arrow. He'd have done very well on the fields of Agincourt or in Sherwood Forest, looking at his stance and arm positioning there. The swimmer, the thrower, also very professional looking to me. I think Chris really is a real sportsman, and perhaps those steps have been specially tailored to his skills, if anyone on the production team knew about them. But goodness me, it is a relief for Merlin fans like me to get in an 8th and final appearance of Merlin here before the end of the series. And aren't those advisors cute, waving to him there? Oh yes, I can hear them too, Merlin says. The advisors seem to take this to mean he can see them as well, so they give him a wave and giggle and laugh together. It's nice to see the advisors enjoying their time on Knightmare like that, I do find. It's funny the answer that Chris gives to the second question here, isn't it? He kind of babbles on about the reasons a shark cannot rest. It would stop breathing and it would drown. And once he's babbled out the core of the truth of that answer, Merlin comes in with truth accepted. I don't think the advisors are quite expecting that. But yes, it's true. Chris gets the essence of the reason that a shark can never rest out there quite well. And of course they're rewarded with the spell Flight. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Karen had that spell in the final episode of Series 2, and unlike here, got to use it. Now this also reminds me of Paul McIntosh writing in the original Paper Eyeshield fanzine. At this point, at the end of Series 3, he could recall the Flight spell being given to Chris, and the series then coming to an end before Chris got a chance to use it. Well, I thought when I first read that in the Eyeshield, that does sound rather disappointing, and it does sound like a very interesting spell. And then when I first saw the very end of Series 2, I thought, there is the Flight spell being used to cross the gap in the bridge over the crevasse. I guess they thought we didn't need to see it again in Series 3, because it was already in the final episode of Series 2. But it would have been better, wouldn't it, to have Chris and team do something with Merlin's magic, instead of going back and filming that stupid, pointless scene with the cauldron and the skull ghosts. I'd rather have seen Merlin give them a spell to use in an interesting way, not necessarily Flight, although they could have stuck with Flight and done something different from the broken bridge, like at the end of Series 2. I'm reminded of some of the adaptations to some of the David Rowe runs that they made for Foreign Knightmare. You could make a kind of double ledge and have the Dungeoneer fly from one to another to get to the door, adapting the Troll Room or the Giant Room into something like that. We could easily have done that, done something a bit different with the Flight spell, or used another spell entirely to do something interesting. So yeah, Merlin's magic should have been used in some way there to finish off the series, rather than that skull ghost nonsense. And it wasn't, which is a bit of a shame, but still, I do enjoy that episode very much, particularly compared to some other final episodes. Thanks for listening to this episode commentary. Join me again next time for the third in my final series of 4 Knightmare commentaries, as I talk about Series 5, Episode 12.